The lamp flickered on Carlos Mendoza's kitchen table, casting long shadows across the worn wood. Past midnight again, and his hands ached from the double shift at the warehouse. But he couldn't sleep yet. Not until he counted. The jar sat between a creased bicycle catalog and a stack of unpaid bills. Elena's birthday was written on the label in his daughter's careful script, the letters wobbly like a fence built by loving but inexperienced hands. 6 months she'd been waiting. 6 months he'd been saving. Carlos dumped the jar's contents onto the table, nickels and dimes scattered like seeds, along with a few precious quarters. His calloused fingers sorted them into neat piles, the way his father had taught him to count when he was young. Each coin represented something surrendered, a lunch skipped, a bus fare walked, an extra hour worked when his back screamed for rest. Through the window, he could see other houses on the street. Warm lights glowed in windows, families together. Probably lives he wasn't part of. Carlos had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years and barely knew his neighbors' names. It was easier that way, safer. The final count came to $147.35, exactly enough for the blue bicycle with the white basket that Elena had circled in red crayon. He'd checked the price at Morrison's bike shop every week to make sure it hadn't changed. Carlos picked up the catalog, studying the picture his daughter had marked. She'd drawn stars around it, added her own wobbly words, "This one, Papa, please." 9 years old next week, and still believed her father could give her the world. If only she knew how hard he worked just to give her this one small piece of it. He thought about the nights she'd gone to bed early without complaining, even though he knew she was hungry. The way she never asked for new clothes when the other kids at school teased her about wearing the same 3 dresses. She deserved this bicycle. She deserved so much more. The lamp hissed softly. Carlos glanced at Elena's bedroom door, slightly ajar. He could hear her breathing, steady and peaceful. She looked like her mother when she slept, the same dark lashes, the same small nose. Maria had been gone 3 years now, taken by pneumonia one terrible winter. He'd promised her in those final hours that he would take care of their daughter alone, that he would be enough. But was he a man who worked 2 jobs and still counted pennies? Carlos returned the coins to the jar, sealing the lid carefully. 4 more days until Elena's birthday. 4 more days until he could give her something good, something bright to cut through the gray sameness of their small life. He allowed himself a tired smile. The bicycle would make her face light up the way it used to when Maria was alive. "Soon, mija," he whispered to the closed door. "Soon, Papa will give you something to smile about." He turned off the lamp and sat in darkness. Outside. A dog barked. A car passed. The neighborhood lived and breathed around him, but Carlos remained an island. It was how he'd chosen to survive, asking nothing, owing nothing, needing no one. A man provides for his own. That was the code he lived by. The only honor he had left. The weight of being enough. Alone. Pressed on his shoulders as he finally stood and walked to his own room. But tonight, for once, the weight felt lighter. 4 more days. Then Elena would have her bicycle. And maybe, just maybe, he would feel like he'd kept his promise to Maria. He didn't know yet how wrong he was about what Elena truly wanted. Elena Mendoza walked home from school under a gray December sky that threatened snow. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders, heavy with books she'd already finished reading. Mrs. Patterson said she was the best reader in 4th grade, but Elena didn't care much about that today. She was thinking about the bicycle. 4 more days until her birthday, and Papa had been saving so long. She'd seen him counting coins late at night when he thought she was asleep. She'd watched him eat less so she could eat more. Her father loved her with a fierceness that both warmed and worried her. The Rodriguez house sat 3 doors down from theirs, a small bungalow with peeling paint and a crooked fence. Elena slowed as she passed. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Rodriguez sitting at her table, and something about the woman's posture made Elena stop completely. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying. Her hands covered her face, and her shoulders shook. On the table in front of her sat a prescription bottle, still in the pharmacy bag. Elena could see the price sticker even from the sidewalk, $83. The window was cracked open despite the cold. Voices drifted out. I don't know where the money will come from. That was Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice breaking. Miguel needs this medicine, but rent is due next week. How can I choose between medicine and food? What kind of mother can't afford both? You're a good mother. Maria! An older woman's voice, Mrs. Rodriguez's sister. Elena thought, we'll find a way. Maybe the church. I've already asked Father Gomez. The benevolence fund is empty until January. Elena's chest tightened. She knew Miguel Rodriguez a little bit. He was in second grade, quiet and small for his age. Last week he'd missed school because he was sick. She hadn't realized how sick. She continued walking, but the image of Mrs. Rodriguez's tears stayed with her. That evening, Elena sat at the table doing homework while her father made dinner. Rice and beans again, stretched thin to last the week. She watched him move around their tiny kitchen. His shoulders stooped with exhaustion. 4 more days, mija, he said, catching her watching. His smile was tired but real. Then we go to Morrison's and get you that bicycle. Elena nodded, but something twisted in her stomach. 4 more days. She looked at her father's hands, scarred from years of hard work. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's hands covering her face in grief. She thought about Miguel, small and sick, needing medicine his mother couldn't afford. That night, lying in bed, Elena stared at the bicycle picture she'd taped to her wall. The blue paint gleamed in the catalog photo. The white basket looked perfect for carrying books or maybe flowers in spring. She'd wanted it for so long she could almost feel the handlebars under her palms. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Mrs. Rodriguez crying. She heard those terrible words. How can I choose between medicine and food? Elena turned over, facing the wall. Her father had saved every penny for 6 months. He'd sacrificed so much. The bicycle was his gift of love. His way of showing her she mattered in a world that often made them both feel invisible. But Miguel needed medicine. Miguel needed to live. The decision formed slowly in her heart, not impulsive but considered. She was 9 years old, nearly grown in some ways, and she understood the weight of choices. She understood that some needs mattered more than wants. Her father had taught her that. Even if he didn't know it yet. Elena got out of bed and walked to the wall. She took down the bicycle picture carefully, then turned it to face backward. She wouldn't look at it anymore. She already knew what she was going to ask for. I know what I'm going to ask for, she whispered to the darkness. Her voice was quiet but certain, the way her mother's voice used to sound when she made up her mind about something important. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Inside, a child made a choice that would change everything. Elena's 9th birthday arrived with pale winter sunlight through the kitchen window. Carlos had woken early to make her favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese and toast. Small luxuries he'd denied himself all week to afford. The envelope sat on the table beside her plate, plain white and weighted with 6 months of love. Happy birthday, mija, Carlos said, watching her face as she came into the kitchen. She wore her best dress, the yellow one that was getting too small but still made her look like sunshine. 9 years old. You're growing up so fast. Elena hugged him tight, her arms around his waist. Thank you, Papa. They ate breakfast together, and Carlos felt something loosen in his chest. This was good. This was right. In a few hours, they'd walk to Morrison's bike shop and she'd pick out her bicycle. And maybe just for a moment, they'd both forget about bills and poverty, and the hard edge of their life. He'd been thinking about Maria all morning. 3 years since she died. But on days like this, he felt her absence like an open wound. She would have made a cake. She would have invited neighbors over for a small party. She would have filled their home with joy instead of just survival. But he'd made a promise to her in those final terrible hours. I'll take care of Elena alone, he'd whispered, as Maria's breathing grew shallow. I'll be enough for her. I won't ask for help. I won't make her feel like a burden on anyone. Maria had squeezed his hand. Had she been agreeing or trying to tell him something else he'd never know? But he'd kept that promise faithfully, asking nothing from anyone, owing nothing, building their small life with only his own two hands. Papa, Elena said quietly, pulling him from his memories. Can I open it? Carlos pushed the envelope toward her. For your bicycle, mija. We'll go to the shop after breakfast. You can pick it out yourself. Elena's hands trembled as she held the envelope. She didn't open it. She just stared at it. And Carlos saw something in her face he couldn't quite read. Not excitement. Something else. Something that made his stomach clench with sudden worry. Papa, she said again, and her voice was very small. I want to give this to Mrs. Rodriguez instead. For Miguel's medicine. The kitchen went silent. Carlos stared at his daughter. Sure, he'd misheard. What? Miguel is really sick. His mama can't afford his medicine. I heard her crying. Elena looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I've wanted the bicycle for so long. But Miguel needs to get better more than I need a bike. Carlos felt like the floor had dropped away beneath him. 6 months. Every penny. Every sacrifice. Every skipped lunch and walked mile and extra hour when his body begged for rest. All of it sitting in this white envelope, and his daughter wanted to give it away. Elena. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Do you understand what you're asking? I saved for 6 months for this bicycle. You've wanted it since summer. I know. Papa. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice grew steadier. And you worked so hard. I know how hard you worked. But Miguel might die without medicine. I heard Mrs. Rodriguez say she has to choose between medicine and food. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. Carlos looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. 9 years old and already wiser than he was, braver than he was. He'd spent 3 years protecting her from the world, keeping her safe in their small, isolated bubble. But she'd seen beyond their walls anyway. She'd seen another child suffering and decided her own wants mattered less. Are you sure? He asked, and his throat felt tight. You've wanted this bike for so long. Elena nodded. I'm sure. Do you understand what Miguel needs, Papa? The question hit him like a fist to the chest. His daughter was teaching him something he'd forgotten, or maybe never learned. That isolation wasn't strength. That providing alone wasn't the only way to love. That sometimes the bravest thing was to give what you couldn't afford to lose. Carlos looked at the envelope on the table. 6 months of his life. He thought about Maria, about the promise he'd made. But maybe Maria hadn't wanted him to do everything alone. Maybe she'd wanted their daughter to grow up knowing she belonged to something larger than just one man's. Stubborn pride. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, mija. If this is what you really want, we'll do it together. Ah. Elena's face broke into a smile that was worth more than any bicycle could ever be. She came around the table and hugged him again, and Carlos held her tight, wondering when exactly she'd grown up enough to teach him what compassion really meant. They sat in silence for a moment, father and daughter, bound by a choice that would change everything. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Inside, Carlos felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed tight for 3 years. Fear, maybe, or hope, or both. Carlos and Elena walked through the neighborhood in silence, the envelope tucked in Elena's coat pocket. The morning was cold and bright, snow crunching under their boots. Carlos had walked these streets for 3 years without really seeing them. Today every detail felt sharp and new. They passed Mr. Chen's corner store. Through the window, Carlos could see the old man arranging produce, the same careful movements every morning. 3 years of nodding politely to each other. Never more than that. Neighbors who weren't neighborly. Elena's hand found his. Are you angry I gave it away? Papa, no. The word came out quickly, truthfully. I'm not angry. I'm just... He paused, searching for words. I'm trying to understand what brave really means. And it looks like you. Mija. She squeezed his hand tighter. The Rodriguez house appeared ahead, small and weathered. Carlos felt his steps slow. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about crossing a threshold he'd maintained for years, the distance between himself and everyone else, the wall that kept him safe and alone. His daughter was asking him to knock it down. They reached the front door. Carlos raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Years of self-imposed isolation pressed down on his fist. What if Mrs. Rodriguez pitied them? What if she thought they were fools for giving away what little they had? What if accepting help meant he'd failed his promise to Maria? Elena reached up and placed her small hand over his. Together. They knocked. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Mrs. Rodriguez stood there in a faded house dress, surprise crossing her face. She knew Carlos only as the quiet man down the street who kept to himself, who worked all hours and never stopped to talk. They'd lived 3 doors apart for 3 years and never had a real conversation. Mr. Mendoza, Elena, White, Mrs. Rodriguez looked between them, confused. Is everything okay? Elena stepped forward before Carlos could speak. She pulled the envelope from her pocket and held it out with both hands, like an offering. This is for Miguel, for his medicine. It's my birthday wish that he gets better. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at the envelope, not taking it. I don't understand. It's $147, Elena said, her voice clear and certain. Papa saved it for 6 months for my birthday. I was supposed to get a bicycle. But Miguel needs medicine more than I need a bike. The woman's hand flew to her mouth. No, I can't, you can't. Her eyes filled with tears. This was for your birthday. For something you wanted. I want Miguel to get better. Elena pushed the envelope forward again. Please, it's what I really want. Carlos watched Mrs. Rodriguez's face crumble. She tried to refuse again, but Elena's gentle insistence wore down her resistance. Finally, with shaking hands, she took the envelope. Then she was crying, and Elena was hugging her. And Carlos stood on the doorstep feeling like he'd stepped into a different world, one where walls came down, and people helped each other, and isolation wasn't the only way to survive. Thank you. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered through her tears. Thank you. You don't know Miguel's been so sick and I was so scared, thank you. They talked for a few minutes more, Mrs. Rodriguez insisting she would pay them back somehow. Elena insisting that wasn't necessary. Carlos said little. But he felt something shifting inside him like ice beginning to crack in early spring. Walking home afterward, Elena asked again, Are you sure you're not angry? Carlos stopped walking. He knelt down so he was eye level with his daughter. Elena, I worked hard for that money. I sacrificed for it. But you just taught me something I'd forgotten. You taught me that giving makes room for something bigger than just us. What's that, Papa? I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'm learning. You're teaching me. Elena hugged him there on the sidewalk. And when Carlos stood up, he noticed Mr. Chen watching from his store window. The old man raised his hand in a wave, a real wave, not just a polite nod. Carlos waved back. Small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something. They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. The neighborhood looked different to Carlos now, not full of strangers, but full of people. People who struggled, people who might understand, people who could be maybe friends. That afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez told her sister about the gift. Her sister told the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper mentioned it to the pastor, and the story began to spread through the neighborhood like light breaking through clouds, touching everyone it reached. By evening, the whole neighborhood knew, not as gossip as something else, something that made people pause and think about their own closed doors. Carlos heard about it first from Mr. Chen. The old shopkeeper stopped him outside the store as Carlos walked home from his first shift. Mr. Mendoza, I heard what your daughter did, what you both did. Carlos felt heat rise to his face. It was Elena's choice. I supported her. Still. Mr. Chen's eyes were bright behind his thick glasses. That's something. A child giving away her birthday money. Made me think about things. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Mr. Chen said, "You know, my shop struggled last year. Real bad. Thought I might have to close. The pastor helped me. Mrs. Kim brought food. People I barely knew showed up." He paused. "I'm just saying. We all need help sometimes." "Nothing wrong with that." Carlos nodded, not trusting his voice. That night. The pastor called Mrs. Rodriguez to discuss her situation. The school teacher mentioned Elena's kindness during parent pickup, and mothers who normally rushed past each other lingered to talk. Each person who heard the story felt something shift inside them, shame at their own isolation. Recognition of shared struggles they'd all been too proud to acknowledge. The next day, Carlos took Elena to the park instead of the bike shop. They sat on a bench together, watching winter birds pick at frozen ground. The sky was pale gray, heavy with snow that hadn't fallen yet. "Do you regret it?" Carlos asked quietly. Elena shook her head. Miguel's mama stopped crying. "That's better than any bike." "Papa," Carlos looked at his daughter, really looked at her. When had she grown so wise he'd been so focused on providing, on being enough alone, that he'd missed her becoming her own person, a person with clearer moral vision than his own? "You know something, Mija. I think you've been teaching me all along." "Teaching you what?" "That we're not meant to carry everything alone." He struggled to find the right words. "I thought after your mama died, I thought being a good father meant doing everything myself. Not asking for help, not needing anyone. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe connection is stronger than isolation." Elena leaned against his shoulder. "You're the best papa. You work so hard." "I just wanted to help someone the way you help me." The simplicity of her logic humbled him. Carlos had been building walls for 3 years, and his 9-year-old daughter had just shown him how to tear them down. They walked home as the first evening stars appeared. At the corner, they passed Mrs. Kim, who actually stopped to talk instead of hurrying past. "I heard about your daughter's gift," she said, her voice warm. "That was a beautiful thing. My grandson is in Miguel's class. He's been worried about him." Elena made the choice, Carlos said. "She's braver than I am." Mrs. Kim smiled. "Children often are. They see clearly what we adults make complicated." She hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, if Elena needs anything, please ask. We're neighbors. We should act like it." After she left, Elena looked up at her father. "See, Papa, people want to help. You just have to let them." That night, lying in bed, Carlos thought about the walls he'd built. He'd told himself they were necessary protection against pity, against feeling like a failure, against breaking his promise to Maria. But maybe the walls had been hurting Elena more than helping her. Maybe she needed to grow up knowing she belonged to a community, not just to one exhausted man trying desperately to be enough. The next morning, the pastor stopped by. "Mr. Mendoza, I heard about Miguel Rodriguez, about what your daughter did." He shook his head in wonder. "In all my years of preaching about giving, I've never seen it lived out so purely. She reminded us all why we came to this neighborhood, to be part of something. It was her choice." Carlos said again, "But you honored it. That takes courage too." The pastor paused. "The church is having a potluck Sunday. I hope you'll both come. Elena should be celebrated for her compassion. And you should know you're not alone in this neighborhood." Carlos promised they'd consider it. After the pastor left, he sat at his kitchen table and let himself cry the first real tears since Maria's funeral. They were tears of grief for the time he'd wasted in isolation, tears of gratitude for his daughter's wisdom, tears of hope that maybe, just maybe, He could learn to live differently, outside his window. The neighborhood came alive with quiet conversations. Neighbors who'd been strangers were becoming friends, and all because a child had chosen compassion over a bicycle. 3 days after the donation, Carlos saw Elena standing outside the schoolyard fence at dismissal. She thought he couldn't see her from where he waited across the street, but he saw everything. Saw her watching the other children ride bikes around the playground. Saw her face wistful, longing, sad in a way that broke his heart. She didn't complain when she climbed into his truck. Didn't mention the bikes. Just buckled her seatbelt and asked about his day. But Carlos had seen her expression, and guilt crashed over him like a wave. Had he failed her, should he have refused her request? Protected her from giving up something she'd wanted for so long? What kind of father lets his 9-year-old daughter sacrifice her own happiness that evening? Elena was quieter than usual. She did her homework without being asked, helped with dinner, went to bed early. Normal behaviors, but something felt different. Carlos noticed her glancing at the blank space on her wall where the bicycle picture used to hang. He lay awake that night, tormented. His poverty had forced this situation. If he made more money, Elena wouldn't have to choose between her bike and another child's medicine. If he'd accepted help earlier from neighbors or church or anyone, they might have had enough for both. His pride, his stubborn insistence on doing everything alone had stolen his daughter's childhood. The next day, Elena came home from school with red eyes. "What's wrong?" Carlos asked immediately. "Nothing, Papa." "Elena." She hesitated. Then the words tumbled out. "Sarah Morrison got a new bike today. She was showing everyone. And Jessica said..." She stopped, biting her lip. "What did Jessica say?" "She said I must not have wanted a bike very bad if I gave the money away. She said I was lying about wanting one." Elena's voice was very small. "But I did want it, Papa. I really did. Miguel needed it more." Carlos pulled her into his arms. "You did the right thing, mija. The brave thing. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." But that night, watching Elena look through bike catalogs in shop windows as they walked home from dinner, Carlos felt his heart shatter. She was trying to hide her longing, but he saw it. He saw everything. "Papa." Elena's voice was worried later that evening. "Are you angry I gave the money away?" The question stabbed him. "No, mija, never. I'm proud of you." Then why do you look so sad?" How could he explain? How could he tell her that he was mourning her lost childhood, her too early adulthood, the sacrifices poverty forced on children who should be carefree? "I just wish I could give you everything," he said finally. Elena climbed into his lap, even though she was getting too big for it. "You give me everything, Papa. You work so hard for me. You make sure I have food and clothes and a home, and now Miguel is getting better because of us. That's everything." Her words should have comforted him. Instead, they made him feel worse. A 9-year-old shouldn't have to be grateful for basics. A 9-year-old shouldn't have to give up birthday presents so other children could afford medicine. A 9-year-old should just be a child. Carlos held her until she fell asleep, then carried her to bed. He stood in her doorway afterward, watching her breathe in the darkness. She looked so small, so vulnerable. He'd been measuring his worth as a father by the wrong things, by how much he could provide alone, by how little he needed from others. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe love wasn't about what he could give alone, but what they could become together. That night, Carlos made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go to the church. He would ask Father Gomez about community resources, about help for families like theirs, not because he was giving up or admitting failure, but because Elena deserved better than a father too proud to ask for help when she needed it. It was the hardest decision he'd made since Maria's death. But watching Elena sacrifice her own happiness had taught him something. Sometimes strength looks like surrender. Sometimes providing means accepting that you can't do it all alone. He went to bed with tears on his face but something like hope in his chest. Tomorrow, he would start tearing down the walls. Tomorrow, he would let people in. For Elena's sake, if not his own. He didn't know that tomorrow. The neighborhood would come to him first. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright. Carlos woke early, planning to walk to the church before his shift started. He'd rehearsed what to say to Father Gomez a dozen times in his head, each version sounding more desperate than the last, but he had to try. For Elena. The knock came at 7:30, unexpected and loud. Carlos answered the door in his work clothes, expecting no one. Instead, he found half the neighborhood on his doorstep. Mr. Chen stood in front, arms full of groceries. Behind him, Mrs. Kim held covered dishes. The pastor carried an envelope. Mrs. Rodriguez stood there with Miguel, the boy looking thin but smiling. Behind them, families Carlos barely knew, people he'd nodded to for 3 years without really seeing. Mr. Mendoza. Mr. Chen's voice was gentle. We heard what Elena did, what you both did, and we've been neighbors, but not neighborly. Time to change that. Carlos stared, unable to speak. His throat had closed completely. We've been talking, the pastor said. Stepping forward. What your daughter did, it reminded us all why we came to this neighborhood. To be part of something. To help each other. But we've all been living like islands, haven't we? Too proud to ask. Too scared to offer. I can't. Carlos's words tangled up. He felt Elena come up behind him, her small hand slipping into his. Mrs. Kim spoke next, her voice warm. We pooled resources. Everyone gave what they could. It's not charity, Mr. Mendoza. It's what neighbors do. She handed him one of the covered dishes. This is for your dinner tonight. No one should work 2 jobs and still have to cook. My shop struggled last year, Mr. Chen added, setting the groceries inside Carlos's door. I thought I'd have to close, but the pastor helped. Mrs. Kim helped. People I barely knew showed up. That's how we survive out here. We take turns being strong. The pastor extended the envelope. This is from everyone. Enough for Miguel's full treatment and for Elena's bicycle. Plus a little extra for both families. We should have done this sooner. But... He paused, searching for words. Sometimes it takes a child to teach us what community really means. She. Carlos tried to refuse, pride surging one last time. The old walls trying to rebuild themselves. I can't accept this. I should be able to... I'm supposed to... Papa! Elena's voice was quiet but firm. She tugged his hand. Let them help. Like we helped Mrs. Rodriguez. The words hit him like light breaking through darkness. His daughter, 9 years old and wiser than anyone he knew, had just given him permission to surrender. To accept, to stop carrying everything alone. Carlos looked at the faces on his doorstep, real faces. Kind faces. Faces marked by their own struggles and survival. These weren't strangers offering pity. These were neighbors offering solidarity. Fellow travelers on hard roads, reaching out because they understood. Something broke inside him, the last wall. The final defense. He tried to speak and couldn't. Tears came instead, hot and sudden. He stood in his doorway and cried in front of his neighbors for the first time in 3 years. Thank you, he finally managed. His voice shook badly. I don't know how to. I can't thank you. You already did, Mrs. Rodriguez said softly. Miguel stepped forward and hugged Elena, the 2 children holding each other while adults wiped their eyes. You taught us what giving really means. You let us be the kind of people we want to be. They stayed for a while. These neighbors who were becoming friends. They brought in the food, put away groceries, talked and laughed and made Carlos's small home feel full in a way it hadn't since Maria died. The pastor prayed a simple blessing over both families. Mr. Chen told stories about his shop's struggles. Mrs. Kim promised to teach Elena her grandmother's baking recipes. When they finally left, giving Carlos space to process everything. He stood in his suddenly crowded kitchen with Elena beside him. The envelope sat on the table heavy with more than just money. It was heavy with connection, with community, with the recognition that they didn't have to be alone anymore. See, Papa. Elena hugged him around the waist. We're not alone anymore. Carlos pulled her close, tears still wet on his face. No, mija, we never were. I just couldn't see it. He thought about Maria, about the promise he'd made. Maybe she hadn't wanted him to do everything alone. Maybe she'd wanted their daughter to grow up knowing she belonged to something larger, a community, a neighborhood, a family that extended beyond blood. That afternoon, Carlos didn't go to his second shift. For the first time in 3 years, he called in and said he needed the day with his daughter. They sat together on their small couch, Elena reading while Carlos just breathed, feeling the weight of isolation finally lift from his shoulders. Outside, snow began to fall soft and gentle, covering the neighborhood in fresh whiteness. Inside, Carlos felt something new growing in his chest. Not just hope. Something stronger than that. Belonging. Saturday afternoon. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood gathered at the community park. Winter sunlight broke through clouds, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Carlos helped Mr. Chen carry tables from the church van, accepting help arranging chairs from men whose names he was finally learning. Good turnout, Mr. Chen observed, looking at the growing crowd. People are excited. They should be. Not every day we get to celebrate something this good. The dual celebration had been the pastor's idea, Miguel's recovery and Elena's birthday. 1 week late but infinitely sweeter for the delay. The whole neighborhood had contributed food, decorations, and one special surprise that sat covered by a tarp near the pavilion. Carlos watched Miguel Rodriguez run across the park with other children. His color returned, his laugh bright in the cold air. The medicine had worked. The boy who'd been so sick 2 weeks ago now played tag with boundless energy. Mrs. Rodriguez stood with a group of mothers, her face lighter than Carlos had ever seen it. Mr. Mendoza. Mrs. Kim called from the food tables. Come try these dumplings. I made extra just for you. Carlos walked over, marveling at how natural it felt now being part of conversations. Accepting offered food. Belonging. 2 weeks ago, this would have terrified him. Now it felt like coming home. Elena appeared at his side, her best dress bright against the snow. Papa, when do I get to see it? Soon, mija, be patient. She bounced on her toes, unable to contain her excitement. The whole neighborhood had kept the bicycle secret, though Elena knew it was coming. Carlos had watched her try not to ask questions, try not to peek, her anticipation pure and joyful. The pastor called everyone to gather. Families clustered around the pavilion, breath misting in the cold air. Miguel stood with Elena, the 2 children holding hands, friends now, bound by the gift that had saved one and transformed the other. Friends, the pastor began, his voice carrying across the park. We're here to celebrate 2 miracles. The first is Miguel's recovery. He paused as everyone applauded, Miguel blushing and hiding behind his mother. The second is the reminder of what community can be when we choose compassion over isolation. He gestured to Elena. This young woman taught us all something. She showed us that giving makes room for receiving, that sacrifice multiplies when shared, that one small act of love can wake up an entire neighborhood. Carlos felt his throat tighten. He'd been crying so much lately, 3 years of held-back tears finally flowing free. And so, the pastor continued, this community has a gift. He nodded to Mr. Chen, who pulled away the tarp. The bicycle gleamed in the winter sun, blue paint perfect, white basket adorned with a ribbon, and a card attached to the handlebars signed by every family in the neighborhood. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For Elena Mendoza. Mr. Chen read from the card. For teaching us what it means to be neighbors, with love from all of us. Elena ran to the bicycle, touching it like she couldn't believe it was real. Carlos followed, kneeling beside her as she traced the handlebars with trembling fingers. It's perfect, Papa. It's perfect. You deserve it, mija. You deserve all of this. Miguel came forward, carrying something behind his back. I made you something, he said shyly. He held out a drawing, two children on bikes, riding together toward a bright yellow sun. For when I get my bike, we can ride together. Elena hugged him, and the crowd murmured approval. Then the pastor said a simple blessing. The Lord provides, but he uses human hands to do it. Today we've been those hands for each other. May we continue to be. They ate together as the sun dipped toward the horizon, tamales and rice, dumplings and bread, dishes from a dozen different traditions all shared freely. Carlos sat among neighbors who'd become friends, watching Elena ride circles around the pavilion with Miguel running alongside. Her joy was uncomplicated now, uncontaminated by guilt. Everyone had been cared for. Mrs. Rodriguez sat down beside Carlos. Thank you, she said quietly, for seeing us, for letting Elena's heart lead. Miguel's doctors say he's going to be fine now. Thank you for teaching me that accepting help isn't weakness. We teach each other. That's what community does. She smiled, watching the children. They're going to be good friends, I think. As sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Carlos helped clean up. He didn't do it alone. There were hands everywhere, helping, working together. The isolated man who'd arrived at this park 2 hours ago would barely recognize the person he'd become. Elena rode up on her bicycle, breathless and glowing. Papa, this is the best birthday ever. Better than if I'd just bought the bike 6 months ago. She considered seriously. Yes. Because now I have the bike and Miguel is better and we have friends. That's way better than just a bike. 9 years old and teaching theology. Carlos hugged his daughter, this small, wise person who'd saved him from himself. You're right, mija. That's way better. They stayed until dark fell and lanterns were lit. Families lingered, reluctant to let the celebration end. It wasn't just about a bicycle or medicine anymore. It was about the recognition that isolation had been starving them all, and they'd finally found their way back to each other. Driving home, Elena said sleepily. Papa, are you happier now? Carlos thought about it. The same aching back, the same tight budget, the same small house, but everything fundamental had shifted. Yes, mija. I am. You taught me how. What did I teach you? That giving makes room for receiving. That we're not meant to carry everything alone. He paused, finding the words. That sometimes the student teaches the teacher. Elena smiled and leaned against the window, her bicycle secured in the truck bed, her heart full. Outside, the neighborhood passed by houses with lights on, families inside. Lives Carlos was finally part of instead of just witnessing. It felt like coming home. Spring arrived slowly, melting snow revealing brown grass that would soon green again. Carlos sat at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning, the door propped open to let in the mild air. Voices from outside drifted in. Mr. Chen, calling hello to Mrs. Kim. Children laughing on the sidewalk. The neighborhood alive with sound. Elena sat beside him, both of them counting coins into a jar. But this jar's label read Community Fund in her careful script. It had been her idea. Started the week after her birthday party. For the next person who needs help, Papa, she'd explained. So, we're ready. The neighborhood had embraced it, each week. Families added what they could. Not much nickels and dimes, mostly. The same small sacrifices Carlos had made alone for 6 months. But together, the jar filled faster than he'd ever managed by himself. $23.40, Elena announced. Finishing the count, that's $5 more than last week. Through the open door, Carlos could see Miguel and Elena's bikes leaned together against the fence. The two children had become inseparable, riding to school together, doing homework side by side, their friendship easy and uncomplicated. Miguel's mother had started working again, The crisis passed, her son healthy and thriving. Mr. Chen appeared in the doorway. "Morning, Carlos, Elena." He'd stopped adding Mr. months ago, and Carlos had stopped feeling the need to maintain formal distance. "Got fresh bread at the shop. Thought you might want some for breakfast." "Come in," Carlos said automatically. "Coffee's fresh." This was normal now, neighbors stopping by. Doors left open. Lives intersecting instead of running parallel. Carlos's home still felt small, but it was no longer empty. People filled it with conversation and laughter and the comfortable ease of friendship. Mrs. Kim arrived an hour later to teach Elena her grandmother's cookie recipe, something she did every Saturday now. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and sugar. With Elena's questions and Mrs. Kim's patient answers, Carlos watched from the table, marveling at how his daughter had gained not just a bicycle, but a whole extended family. That afternoon, the pastor stopped by with news. "The community fund hit our first goal," he said, showing Carlos the total from all the contributing families. "We have enough to help the Martinez family with their medical bills. Thought we should present it tomorrow at service. If you and Elena want to be there." Carlos agreed immediately. Sunday service had become routine, not from religious obligation, but from the simple pleasure of being part of something. Elena sang in the children's choir now. Carlos helped with building maintenance. They belonged. Later, Carlos and Elena walked to the park. She rode her bicycle while he walked beside her. The evening warm with the promise of longer days ahead. They passed houses where he now knew names and stories: the Johnsons who'd had a baby in March, old Mr. Patterson who'd fallen ill and been cared for by rotating neighbors, the new family from El Salvador, who the community was helping get settled. "Papa," Elena said, riding slow circles around him. "Are you happy we stayed here instead of moving somewhere bigger like you talked about?" Carlos had considered leaving after Maria died, finding a bigger city, better job opportunities, starting fresh. But staying had been easier. And now he understood it had also been right. "Yes, Mija, this is home. These are our people. I'm glad. I like having people." Such a simple statement. Such profound truth. Carlos had spent 3 years trying to need no one, and his daughter had shown him that needing people wasn't weakness. It was what made life worth living. That evening, they returned home as the sun set. Carlos made dinner while Elena did homework at the table, their movements synchronized from months of practice. Through the window, he could see lights coming on in neighboring houses. Mr. Chen closing his shop. Mrs. Rodriguez calling Miguel inside, the pastor walking his dog. Ordinary scenes, but they filled Carlos with extraordinary gratitude. "Papa," Elena looked up from her math, "what did I teach you that day I gave the money to Mrs. Rodriguez?" Carlos came to sit beside her. "Considering, you taught me that giving makes room for receiving. That isolation is its own kind of poverty. That sometimes—" He paused, emotion catching his throat. "Sometimes the student teaches the teacher. And the richest man isn't the one who needs nothing. It's the one who has people to need, and people who need him. That's wealth. Mija." Elena smiled and returned to her homework. Carlos watched her bent head, her careful pencil strokes, the concentration on her young face. 9 years old when she'd changed his life. 9 years old and wiser than he'd been at 35. Outside, spring's first warm breeze carried the scent of thawing earth and coming growth. The seasons were turning, winter giving way to renewal. Carlos thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, isolated, exhausted, measuring his worth by how little he needed from others. That man felt like a stranger now. As darkness fell completely, Carlos lit the lamp on the table, the same lamp that had illuminated his lonely counting months ago. But now Elena sat beside him in its glow, and the door stood open to neighborhood sounds. And the jar they counted wasn't just for one family, but for all of them. The lamplight no longer illuminated loneliness. It illuminated shared purpose, collective hope, the warm knowledge that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Elena finished her homework and came to stand beside her father at the window. Together they looked out at their neighborhood, their community, Their home. Lives interconnected. Struggles shared. Joys multiplied through connection. It's nice, Elena said softly. Not being alone anymore. Carlos pulled her close. Yes, mija, it's nice. He thought about Maria, about the promise he'd made to care for Elena alone. He hoped wherever she was. She understood that he'd learned something better than solitary survival. He'd learned how to live, outside. The first stars appeared. Inside. Father and daughter stood together in lamplight. No longer islands, but part of an archipelago connected. Sustained. Belonging. Spring had come at last. And with it, the quiet joy of knowing that isolation had finally, beautifully, ended.